Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. Before today's conversation, we're going to start with a short video presentation of some images from Enrique Martínez Celaya's Cuban trilogy, of which our exhibition, The Sextant, is a part. So please enjoy. Welcome again. Thanks for joining us. I'm Gina Segal, Special Projects Assistant here at the Wende, and I have the honor of getting us started today. We have with us the very special Enrique Martínez Celaya. Hopefully you all have had a chance to take in our exhibition in the gallery that opened earlier this month, Enrique Martínez Celaya, the Sextant. And if you haven't, there will be some time after the program to check it out. The museum is open until 5 p.m. today. So we're so excited to have this work of Enrique's at the Wende. It's our first large solo exhibition here ever, so quite historical in that way. And even though it is singular in that way and so unique in many other ways as well, I also feel that it's so in keeping with everything we try to do here with all of our exhibitions. There's this experiential, immersive quality to the exhibition that transports us through space and time. There are themes of memory, of contradiction or dichotomy, and of the connection between past and present. And even though there is specificity to the works being shown, it could be said that the exhibition prompts more questions than it gives answers. So these through lines among all our exhibitions are so important to and shaped by our chief curator and director of programming, Segal, who I'm also excited to introduce, who will be in conversation with Enrique today. I've had the pleasure over the past few months of reading and editing Yu's texts about Enrique's work and have been so struck by his insights, his contextual awareness, the way he draws history and art history into conversation with the work. So I feel we're really in for a treat with a live conversation between these two today. I'll just give some background information about our guest in case people don't already know him well. Enrique Martínez Celaya is an artist, author, and former scientist whose work has been exhibited internationally and is held in more than 60 public collections, including the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Moderna Museet in Stockholm, the Huntington, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. He's completed major projects and installations worldwide, among them at the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C., the Berliner Philharmonie in Berlin, and the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Havana. He's also participated in two-person exhibitions with historical figures like Albert Pinkham Ryder, Kata Kollwitz, and Diego Velázquez. Enrique is also the author of 9 books on art, philosophy, and poetry, including 2 volumes of collected writings and interviews published by the University of Nebraska Press. He recently completed his first novel and has co-authored Tending the Fire, Creativity, Purpose, and the Unfolding Self with Jungian psychoanalyst James Hollis, as well as Pebbles, The Commonalities and Divergences of Art and Science with Nobel laureate chemist Roald Hoffmann and philosopher and physicist Alexander Svitin, all forthcoming, so look out for those. He's the first provost professor of humanities and arts in the history of USC. He's also served as Roth Family Distinguished Visiting Scholar and Montgomery Fellow at Dartmouth College. In 2021, he was awarded a Doctor Honoris Causa by Otis College of Art and Design. He was the first visual arts fellow at the Huntington Library, where his sculpture there became the institution's first contemporary acquisition in its century-long history. Enrique began formal training as a painter's apprentice at 12. At 16, he built a laser that received national recognition, and during his youth published poems, essays, and short stories. He studied applied physics, literature, and art at Cornell, earned an MS, and completed doctoral coursework in quantum electronics at UC Berkeley. He later attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture and received his MFA from UC Santa Barbara, immediately afterward joining Pomona College as a professor, and 2 years later receiving the Young Talent Award from LACMA. I also wanted to mention that this isn't the first time that Enrique has taken part in an interview here at the Wende. In 2021, he was interviewed by our student council as part of their series In Search of Truth. And that interview is actually on display in the galleries right now in one of our hallways. It's also on YouTube, and I really recommend it, especially if you're left wanting more after today. It's a great interview. So Yus and Enrique will engage in their discussion, then we'll have time for some questions from the audience at the end. At that time, please raise your hand if you have a question, and one of our team members will bring you a microphone. I would like to thank Rick Feldman and Susan Horowitz for their generous support of all of our programming, as well as Enrique's team and our own events and engagement team for making all of our programs possible. With that, please join me in giving you and Enrique a warm welcome. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, welcome, Enrique. As Gina mentioned, this is the first ever art installation we did at the Wende Museum. And for a very good reason, because I've never met an artist who so excitingly and convincingly combines art, philosophy, poetry, and history in a way opening up new perspectives that we also strive to do in our exhibitions. I'm very happy this came about, and I'm also later in this conversation curious to hear why you wanted to exhibit at the Wende Museum. But let me start with something else. A short time ago you mentioned to me that during your life you have built 29 houses. So my first question to you is, how many houses did you build within other houses?
Well, thank you very much for being here. It's a pleasure to have the conversation with you and to be here. I have, this is my first house within another house. But the whole time I was preparing this exhibition, I was conscious of that double roofing, which has a particular resonance as shelter.
Can you expand a little, what is the meaning of having a double roof for you?
You know, the very idea of the central piece from the Sextant is the house of my childhood. So what a house like that represents in terms of protection and shelter and liminality and in between and all those things, which I'm sure we'll get into. The idea of it being contained, not only within a roof, but within a museum roof. There's an aspect of preservation and also an aspect of relic-like quality. You know, even though museums don't like to think of themselves as reliquaries, but there is an aspect of preservation that comes with it, in the same way that in the hallways you have these other objects behind glass. This house here, in some ways, is virtually behind glass in some manner. So I was thinking about that. And appropriately, it's a house that in some ways deserves protection.
So let's talk a little bit about the concept of home. You mentioned it's a scale model. 90% of the house your father built between 1957 and 1933. And it's actually a place where history and your personal memory come together. It was a wild time in Cuban history, thinking of the Cuban Revolution, the embargo, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it was also a wild time in terms of your family. Of course, that had strong implications on the feeling of being at home in this house. What was that like? And can you tell a little bit about how this historical context informed your experiences?
So the house was built between, as you said, between 1957 and 1963. So this is the high point of the Civil War, of the Cold War, and especially in a place like Cuba. The revolution happened in '58, Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs, which was very significant for Cubans, and the embargo. So that historical arc also have profound consequences for the actual building of the house. My father started when he was 17 to build it, and then materials ran out, so which is why it stretched the construction so much. So part of the Cold War consequence to our experience, the intersection of the personal and this historical, is that the idea of being in war with everybody, that was a big part of our upbringing. And then within that war that Cuba found itself against, we were at war with that war as people who wanted to leave the country. For when you are not a supporter of the revolution, which my parents were not, you are called a worm, and we will introduce ourselves as worms. So that already places a very particular sense of the personal versus the societal. When you are called a worm, it's a very specific position to be in. So the idea of home for us was an in-between place. It was not like what I hope I will have for my family now, because it was I was born in 1964. In 1967 or 68, my parents applied to leave Cuba. And you have to apply it and then wait for the exit to be granted. So from that moment on, that house was a purgatory or a waiting room. It became a place that we waited for our exit. So the idea of home changes when there is that sense of being in between, that we're no longer in Cuba entirely, and we were not in Spain anymore yet. So everything was tenuous and ungraspable. And that was my sense of home in that sense.
So if you read philosophers about home, from Martin Heidegger to Peter Sloterdijk, they always tend to emphasize this aspect of protection and your personal identity being developed there. Your experience clearly was very different. Actually, Peter Sloterdijk compares the private home with a mother womb, but then an artificial one. Having had that experience at a very young age, I know it impacted your sense of home, but how do you feel about the concept of home nowadays?
Yeah, that's a very good question, a good one. So I think that the desire for home, Heidegger speaks of the idea of dwelling, and the idea of home, it's so fundamental to us. But when the traditional home, have this kind of instability that comes with being a refugee or an immigrant or about to be an exile, typically something comes to replace that idea. For some people it's religion, some other things. For me, it really was art. And even as if you look to the windows, you can see those letters that I sent to my father, which have been made into paintings. Well, those are my drawings. And in those drawings, I felt very much at home. And to this day, even though for my family I try to give them a sense of home, my own most comfortable home is the home of art and literature and so on. So it is there that I dwell. It is there that I find context for my life. It is there that I understand the negotiations we make between who we are, what we do, the context around it.
Right. So if we have your youth home in the museum, does it feel for you in a way uncomfortable because it was not really a home in the protective sense, or does it feel like home because it is an artwork about being at home?
I mean, it's home in both ways. I mean, despite what I've said, I mean, it was my first home, and I knew nothing about it, and there are many associations I have for with that. I mean, I told a story to a group of friends that I was just talking to, and this is what happens in a home, which is what defines a home. But this would be a funny story. It's not what you imagine a home to be like. But in Cuba, everything, when the food and so on, we had to get these ration cards. And we can only get so much. But every once in a while, there would be a shipment that would come from other parts of the world, Russia usually, or Czechoslovakia, or Poland. And sometimes those things would be freely, there was no restrictions. So my mother found out that for this shipment from Czechoslovakia, there would be some juices, these little fruit juices. And she went and got them and brought them, and I never had juices like that, and we were all excited. So my mom and I began to drink the juices, and turned out they were wine coolers. So we both got drunk together. I got drunk at 6. But in some ways, that's home. So when I look at that little part of the house that juts out where the kitchen was, I remember just by looking at it, that moment of leaning against that wall. So it was a home, but then this is the other home, the home of art and as well. So it brings both of them together.
So I mentioned why I was excited to have your installation at the Wende Museum. Why were you excited to present your work at the Wende Museum?
I mean, I can't imagine a better context for a house. I mean, this house cannot be separated, apart from my biography, which I'm going to come back to that in a second. But this house was a time. No one else lived in this house. After we left, we were the first people to live there. My father built it. And after we left, it became the palace of the weddings, where people get married. So no family ever lived there again. So in many ways, we and this house defined a moment that is what the Wende Museum is trying to understand and preserve and investigate, which is the relationship with the Cold War, what it points to, what it says about us, the historical context. So my idea is that the rest of the Wende programs historically that you have done, what is in the collections and the vitrines, and hopefully what comes into the future, all of it would form like a constellation that offers a context to this house. If this was shown, say, at one of the art museums, other art museums in town, it will be much more understood as a work of art, with less of a conversation with history and more a conversation with art. And for me, history put such pressure on the liminality of this house that it was critical that it will have conversation with the other things you do here.
So let's talk a little bit more in detail about the installation. First of all, of course, the thing that immediately attracts attention is the shiny white surface of the house and the sculpture of the horse and sleigh. They are coated in sugar. Maybe just for context, can you let us know whether that is probably not a reference to Home Sweet Home, but what made you cover this house and this sculpture in sugar?
So anything I'm going to say from now on that is specific about the work, you should understand it as incomplete and probably a distortion. Because most of what, even though I spend a lot of time thinking and writing about my work, one of the things that I have learned over time is that so much other processes, other than intellectual processes, are going in the creation of a work of art. Intuitions, things that we barely understand, and we endeavor to give them words. And sometimes we feel comfortable when we hear a word that explains something, not realizing that that word just coded the possibility of true understanding and awareness, because now that will replace our engagement with it. So now with that caveat or disclaimer, so the house was built in the town of Nueva Paz, Cuba, which is a town in the southern part of Cuba, which was built primarily to serve the sugar industry. And my father worked at the sugarcane processing facility. Everything that I grew up with had to do with sugar in those years. And the last few years that I was in Cuba is the years that, so this is connected to the Cold War, that Cuba was very much interested in becoming the top producer of sugar in the world. So you can imagine for a small island to become the top producer of sugar in the world, a lot has to happen. So there was no conversation other than sugar when I was growing up, seemingly. And my father because he worked at the sugarcane processing. That was very, very, very much present for us. So there is that specific biographical context. But more importantly than that is a sense of the way I'm using sugar here as a coating. And the coating, sort of like the way time and dust cover our memories, our histories, and forever those both preserves and hides that. So I was interested in that element of sugar in that sense. And if you notice, when you go back to the exhibition, you will see that that the sleigh that has an amount of sugar in it, that sugar drops down and then goes up the conveyor belt and dumps it into the house. Well, that conveyor belt assembly with the sleigh is function as an hourglass in the way time, for all of us, distances more and more from history, from our memories. So sugar is playing a role as that as well. And is playing a third and weirder role too, which is when you look at it at first you think of snow, at least I do. When you look at that horse, it looks like a horse coated with snow. And for us, the United States and almost every other country outside of Cuba was called the North. And the North is, no one did we say United States, we said the North. The North was a cold, strange place that we have heard of it. And the way I've heard of it, for example, imagery, for a long time I'd never seen snow. I never saw snow, obviously, until I went to Spain. But even in drawings, I've only seen black and white drawings on an illustrated by Ilya Rapin, because he illustrated Tolstoy stories for children that were given to us, and that's the only reference I had of snow. But I imagine the entire world looks like Russia. So.
And you had a toy, right, of a horse and sleigh as well. Then, you can stop me when I'm getting too specific, but the sleigh has the form of a pair of lungs, and there is also a flower and lung sculpture in the house. Does that point to a sense of being suffocated by sugar? Is there also the fact that there is this amount of sugar inside the house? Did that define everything and not leaving any space for other reflections?
Yeah, I mean, so I am not interested. There are artists that are interested in confessional work, and by that I mean work about one's life and telling people the story. I'm only using my story as a means to get at something else. So that's the weird thing as I answer these questions, because you will think, oh, that's why he did it. But what I'm hoping is that by starting in the sort of Kierkegaard sense, started from the extremely subjective to get to something objective, that somehow I'm using my biography to speak about something that has very little to do with me specifically and larger questions. But the lungs, of course, I was asthmatic as a kid. Severe asthma in a place that we didn't have a lot of medicines, even though medicine is very good in Cuba, medicines are scarce. So my associations with the house was one of suffocation, literally. And there's an aspect of time and that existential condition that if you see the containment of ourselves in this life, there is a suffocating aspect to it if you think about it hard enough, and trying to kind of negotiate those forms of trying to breathe in light of that. The relationship between breathing and crying, the relationship to the change of breath, as Paul Celan will talk about, where you go from inhaling to exhaling and that in between place, life occurs. So when you cannot breathe, something happens in those kinds of exchanges. So the idea that lungs will be present on this point to that, but also point to that which makes us very much alive, and air, which is why I introduced the vessels into the horse and the lung things. I was very interested in the body being pointed to by those vessels.
So one of the first things that struck me walking into the installation is the contradiction between the white of the house and the sculpture and the black background of the three paintings surrounding it. At the same time, the house is enclosed and those paintings are very open. They show a starry night or just a black night. Can you say a little bit about this color contrast?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that this black paintings, or mostly black paintings, are pointing to something that is sort of the opposite of what you're seeing color-wise, as you pointed to, was very important and very intentional. The other thing that was intentional, which is not obvious, as a former physicist, whenever I paint stars, I feel this very important, and this informs the entire installation of my entire practice as a whole. It's very important right from the beginning to give up the weapons, meaning the cosmos is something so vast, not only in size is vast, but conceptually impenetrable. Then the very idea that we can hold a piece of it by putting little white dots on a black field is, no matter how accurate you think you are, is a testament both to the hubris as well as to the charm of being human. This idea that we feel that we can hold this. So when I paint the sky, I always do it very crudely, because right from the beginning I'm saying, here I am engaging in something that I'm going to fail at, and all I'm trying to do is point to that failure more than to the sky. So to have the context of those paintings create a framework for the rest of the work was very important. They're paintings of that which cannot be painted, first and foremost. And then, of course, they are pointing to these travelers. And those travelers are, of course, absent in the house. The house is empty. Can I say something else, a minor digression? I want to say this because I always think that one of the most important things of these conversations is to be properly understood to the extent that it is possible. We are in an environment that has not always been the case, where art has to be talked about in this particular way and given this kind of message and iconographic readings and so on. And every little painting has a message. And I find that such a trivial way to think of artwork. If the artwork is worth anything at all, it will transcend and obliterate any story that is told about it. And the problem with stories is that they make us think we know when we don't. Sometimes I've used the example, which is, a drastic example, but I think it drives the point home. If I say this phrase, Carol Frost, the son of Robert Frost, shot himself with a rifle, it seems like I'm telling you information that is important. And it gives you the impression that you know what happened. But the fact is, those words should be pointing to the fact that you have no idea of what actually happened. And not because the puzzle exists in the nature of the events, but because those events are unknowable. And any experience of them will show you that you cannot know them, even if you were to have been there. And the work of art is somewhat like that. But we are constantly and educating this didactic by way, you are not this, and I'm not reacting because you're asking me this. But I want that to float about our entire conversation, that we have been indoctrinated into this little story approach to art. You see like some horrific work and somebody tells you a little story about it, or a great work and somebody tells a little story about it. And like, that's what people engage with. And to me, I find it that slowly through our ears, we're losing the capacity to recognize what's in front of us experientially.
No, and actually some of my questions might be challenging you in that direction, just to make that clear. And that is also true for my next question. There are some sculptures in and around the house. There's the flowers with the lungs, there's the canary, there's the rooster, there's the horse and sleigh. Traditionally, you could think those are symbols of something, or something you want to let us know about your experiences. But you are very careful in not characterizing your artwork as symbolic. So is it an invitation to use these sculptures as a starting point for free associations? And if that is more the case, are there any false interpretations of your work, or is anything possible?
I mean, anything is possible, but not necessarily right. The symbolic understanding of art is that there's a somewhat of a correlation, like a symbol points to signifier, that there is this direct thing, and we feel comfortable with it. Most people stand in front of a painting and they always ask you a contextual context, like what does it mean? What does the elephant mean? Or whatever. And when you take the rooster, for instance, if we decide to dedicate an entire talk to talk about the rooster, I will not be able to exhaust it. Not just what it points to, but the allusions around it. What it means when the rooster, what is a rooster and what is a rooster covered with sugar? Is it a different object? Is it a different symbol? And what is a rooster covered with sugar sitting on the floor of a house? That's a very different thing. But we tend to isolate these things and try to get a grammar of signification, which tends to be a simplification of the encounter, and which is why so many people feel so insecure about the work of art, because rather than bringing themselves into the experience, they're looking for, like a Jung's man and his symbols kind of idea, that there will be a symbolic decoding of the symbols. And of course, all of you are smart enough to give me 10 associations of a rooster. So it really doesn't matter mine in that sense. But it doesn't mean that there's not tremendous specificity to this rooster as a work of art in the place. But the specificity of it is a specificity of circumstance and experience that brings together significations, but also bring together what it is in itself in this context. So I'm sure it was not very clear.
If I may interrupt here, would it make sense to somehow compare your installation with a 3D collage where all the elements inform and contextualize each other?
Yeah, I mean, every work of art is the best theorem that an artist can make of where things are. You know, so like, and everything depends on each other. It depends on the fact that the walls are gray, and it depends on the fact that the Wende, when you walk in, you come through this door and you see that sculpture of Lenin, and it depends on all those things are affecting. The more sensitive you are, the more things I will be at play. I mean, if you're somewhat asleep, then perhaps less things affect you. But the more awake you are to the experience, the more everything is contributing. And if you have this object here, say a rooster, and you put it right behind or near a mirror, that's an entirely different rooster.
The German word Wende means transformation. Would you say an aim of your work is to transform people viewing it?
I used to say that. I think what I am trying to do is to make the most resonant, clearest experience that I can of a certain condition, of a certain state of being, and hoping that create bridges. This is a bridge. This conversation is a bridge. What you wrote at the entrance is a bridge. Bridges to bring you, who have a completely different life and experience, to that place and offer you a place to stand so you can have your own experience. Of course, it will be transformative because everything is transforming us at all times. You know, if I go outside and walk in the granite, I'm somehow transformed by the experience. But only you get to define that transformation. Only you get to. You can read the Brother Karamazov, and the question is whether you're transformed after reading that book or not. How and in which way and to what extent depends on you, on where you come to it, when the book comes into your life. But related to your question, there's nothing in my work that is not intended to make demands upon you as a viewer. Moral, spiritual demands, intellectual demands. Which is why I can never typically repeat versions of my painting like some other artists might do, because once those moral demands are made in a work of art, I don't understand making another one like it, because it already was made.
So, as we saw, this installation is the third part of a trilogy, 3 exhibitions that in some way or another also refer back to your history and to Cuba. Why this memory orientation at this stage of your life?
And then he comes with that question. I mean, I am at the stage of my life that, I never have done a work about Cuba before. Many artists use, especially, I think, artists who have exiles or refugees or whatever have often used that history, and I have not, at least not in a direct way. So the idea of taking this into a trilogy is completely uncharacteristic if you know the rest of my work. So I've been asking this question that you're asking. You know, I'm at the age that my grandparents were when I lived in that house. And I think in some ways I am trying to explore how this whole experience shaped partly my understanding of being, my understanding of my relationship to Cuba and Latin America, and the sense of what time is and what memory is. I mean, even though, and I should just say this because I think, you know, like, even though that history was peppered with a lot of significant things and some very terrible things, this is not really an exploration of psychology or my childhood trauma or anything like that. It is an exploration of conditions and what cannot be known, but you still want to know. And I think as I get older, these things become more and more important. I mean, this notion of know thyself nonsense. You know, that's the more I live, the more I understand how oversimplified that statement is.
Have you ever encountered responses to your more recent exhibitions of people who expect you to, in one form or another, represent Cuban culture? And how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, you're really hitting the some of the questions here. You know, I cannot imagine being and thinking as I do without being Cuban and without that background, in the same way that I cannot imagine being the kind of artist I am without having my adolescence partly shaped by Latin American culture, literature, especially poetry. That was my, to use James's term, my sentimental education was made through literature, in particular Latin American literature, even though now other literatures are perhaps more active in my thinking. That being said, of all the institutions in the world that own my work, only, I used to be one, now so it's two of them out of over 60 have been acquired by the Latin American Curator. So if that doesn't sound like an answer, it is an answer. Because it's even in an environment where people are supposed to be open-minded about what it means to be Latin American, what it means to be Caribbean. When people are experts in this field, they cannot understand that someone may use Immanuel Kant, as I did in my late 20s, as a source for work, but anyone who has spent 25 minutes in the Caribbean, which is so defined by a political ideology, where Marx makes was such a powerful influence to our thinking as teenagers, there's no way of thinking of Marx without Hegel and Kant, and that's how I learned it. I learned in the Caribbean, I didn't learn it at Cornell. So the answer to your question is this notion of Cuba, of what it means to be Cuban. I feel that constantly I have to be battling the expectations of what that means. But sorry, I'm meandering. But at the same time, one of the gifts of being in exile is that when you are in exile, you sort of leave your country behind, but you gain the entire world. So, for instance, my own experience of exile was best understood for me in my mid-20s when I discovered the poetry of Paul Celan, and I thought about his own situation in Germany, during the Nazi regime, and his mother being killed by the Nazis, and his desire to rescue language from the Nazis. And in thinking of Celan and his approach to that loss and to that confrontation, I understood much better my own situation of exile, as I understood it much better when I read Milosz, who's a Polish writer, and those people gave shape to my exile. They made me understand what it was. In listening to Milosz struggles living in California and thinking back to the homeland and still writing in Polish, made me think, well, oh yeah, that makes sense. So this idea that when you leave your country, you gain the world in a certain manner, there's a lot of truth to that.
Which might be another aspect also of the star-filled skies in your paintings, I feel. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned the importance of Latin American literature when you were young. You have once described literature, poetry, philosophy, science, and art as different means to try to understand the world around us. And since you have focused so much on visual art, what do you think is characteristic of visual arts in terms of understanding the world or expressing yourself that the other mediums cannot accomplish?
I think it's funny because the answer to that keeps changing in my mind. But one of the things that I love about being a visual artist is that you're sort of a manual labor. You're a worker not only with your hands, but just very physical. And it connects you to materiality. When I start thinking a lot of things in my head and begin to make paintings and to have ideas, the moment I get to the studio and have to get my hands completely covered in paint or building something physical that doesn't want to stand up, there's something very grounding that happens with that negotiation with the world that happened to materials. In physics or in poetry or in philosophy, it's way, way too easy to drift off. Even though physics still has connection to the world, a lot of the time you can exist for months without being in the world. So I think there is a primacy of that experience that I love about the work of art. I also very interested in the objects of the world and their resonance in themselves. And I think in the visual arts, I feel that I am able to bring philosophy and poetry. In fact, I think of my work as a form of writing. So that's the reason. I think that's the primary reason.
Gina, in her introduction, mentioned two forthcoming books. One you are writing together with a Jungian psychoanalyst, and another with a Nobel Prize laureate chemist. What do these partnerships mean to you, and do they help you to understand your own work in a different way?
Yeah, so I'm interested in everything. If I meet each of you and you tell me what you do, and we talk a little bit about what you do and what you're interested in, I'll be interested. It's like the world is so beautiful and complex, and there's so many ways to understand it. In my own interest, I find that by writing the book with Jim Hollis, of course, is somebody who I admire. It's a process of intimidation which I appreciate. There's a tendency, I think, for most of us to be experts on something, which we kind of continue to milk that cow as long as we can. You become the expert in a tiny field, and you do it, and you do more of it. And in the visual arts, unfortunately, because there's a mercantile aspect to it, you can produce the same object a million times with slightly different variations of color. So the idea of having this to answer questions with somebody who is clearly more capable than I am is a great example for me of the kinds of things that I want to be engaged with, which is a humbling experience, is an insistence of trying to get out of my own swamp of thought and maybe think a little bit better. It forces certain authenticity, especially because Jim will be able to read right through my inauthenticity. So that was incredible. And then Roald Hoffman, of course, is one of the most beautiful minds I've ever encountered. He's a Holocaust survivor, a poet, a Nobel Prize chemist, taught himself like 9 languages. So to do anything with Roald is it's just a gift. And to talk about art and science with him is incredible. We had also a Russian philosopher with us, which added an element of triangulation, I suppose. So for me, those are challenges. I'm interested in a discomfort that comes from intellectual relocation and to explore these things. And sometimes, you can say, well, I know something about science, but you gotta say that. I remember a friend saying one time, if you ever go to China and people ask you if you play ping pong, the answer is always no, because everybody is so much better. And when you can say, well, I can say I know something about science, but when I talk to Roald Hoffman, you gotta walk in very quietly into that room, So that's the reason.
I think this is almost a great moment to turn to the Q&A, but I would love to ask you one last question. That is, when I visited your home some time ago, I saw a book there, The Future of the Past. And that actually inspired me to ask you the question. We are living in such crazy times right now with such dramatic changes. How does the present impact your past?
Yeah. We tend to think about the fact that the past is settled and the future is what we're unfolding to. But I think you have experienced all this in your life, that the present continuously changes your past. What you understood of it, things that seem inconsequential, gain in tremendous consequence. Some years when something occurs. So the past is always being negotiated by the present, not just in form, but also invented. So for me, when I look at the past, I'm never looking at nostalgia or not looking at some story that I know, but the past is primarily a mystery. A mystery. All I have to do is go into any one of the memories or any one of the objects even of the past. And what I find there is what I don't know and what I might never know and what is unknowable. And all that is fascinating. So The moment we live right now, as somebody who comes from a totalitarian country, and who then, after that, went to live during Franco's Spain. So it's impossible not to think of many of the questions in the world right now, not think of it in a very political sense, as inform and changing that past and understanding of the institutions and so on. And I would say one more thing about that. When you have children, I think the past is always being actively changed by encounters with your children in the present, which then make you relocalize yourself into the consciousness that you were as a child, and then look from that perspective at everything you thought you understood, and then you understand it again. Sometimes understand it again less. And certainly when you have children, you also understand is not the right word, become more aware of what parenting was when you were a kid. In that house there, I was only a kid. Now when I do that house, I'm both a kid and a parent.
It's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. So, please raise your hand if you have a question, and Julie will come to you with the camera, with the mic. Yeah.
Hi. David Nelson, Culver City resident. Thanks very much. So with appreciation for how you started the talk with the caveat or disclaimer of your art and art in general living in a kind of liminal, pre-lingual space, I want to thank you for trying to put words to your art for the last hour. I also appreciate this notion of our understanding of art being dependent on the sensitivity with which we come to it with. And so that leads to a question that I had in mind when you were speaking. The installation seems completely immersive. And so I'm wondering at what point you contemplated the viewer. I guess maybe it's somewhat of a process question, but when did the viewer, it seems like a very personal, you said it's not an exploration, but some kind of personal exercise, but when did the viewer come into it for you and their experiencing it?
I mean, it was there all along. Although I always think of, I made paintings and sculptures. I started as a painter. I have done these environments, large environments like this a few times, and I'm always thinking of the viewer. But this is a very good question you're asking, because when I was in graduate school, there was nonstop talk about the audience, which reminded me a lot of my upbringing. When people talk about the masses, like, who are these people? There's only individuals. So I never tried to imagine, for instance, we don't know each other, you came here, you come from a whole life. And I don't want to presume to imagine what kind of person you are as you come to my work. And that's true. So what I'm always trying to think of the viewer is, how can I present myself authentically and have a work that will have some points of entry, some things that are emotionally sensitive enough to be able to show that sensitivity to a generous person engaging. And I say generous because if it's very difficult to negotiate a thing with somebody who is not. And then how you move them through. So the entire design of this is, how do I move that person through? And for example, probably the biggest challenge of this exhibition is one that people barely pay attention to. Those plastic things that you stand up in front of the window. Once you make a sure house, how you get people to the window without destroying it? So that was a problem. And how do you do it such that it's conceptually sound? So those plastics with those drawings from my childhood give you a place to stand, which is the place I stood. And that relationship between you and I, that you stand where I stood, but you are not me, and you're much older than I was, is a kind of a transaction, emotional transaction that I'm trying to make. So, I believe I have benefited tremendously from my encounters with works of art and works of literature. I mean, they have changed my life, and they have made my life much better than it would be otherwise. So I'm hoping to offer that to some people in some manner. And in that exchange, I'm also thinking of the viewer, not because I have lessons to teach, which is sometimes the way art is presented. I have such great wisdom, I'm giving some of that to you. I am hoping that you and I share in the same concerns, in the same humanity, in the sense, how different can we possibly be once you live this life for more than a couple of years. So in all those ways, the viewers thought about.
Thank you so much. My name is Ruth Sharon, and to give context to my question about relocation is that I grew up in Chicago, and in my early 20s, I went to Latin America. I visited 19 countries and 54 cities. The only Latin country I didn't visit was Cuba, because I wasn't allowed to go there. But I experienced enormous culture shock when I came back. I had started speaking English with a Spanish accent. People thought I was not from America. And so I know in your history, your biography, you moved, even though they were all Spanish-speaking countries, but you moved. And my question is, was culture shock good for creating great art?
I mean, it's hard to have any kind of prescription to create great art. Art is difficult no matter where you come from. And you have sometimes somebody like Giorgio Morandi staying in the same place, working in the same little place with his sisters, and make some great artwork. And then you have some itinerant artists who are lived in 27 places, and their work is hollow. It is true that this location and confrontation makes you, we have this notion of identity. And one of the things that exile does is very quickly strips that notion away from you. Joseph Brodsky talked about this. He said that, that exile accelerates our recognition of our strangeness. So did Julia Kristeva, the sense of being a stranger to ourselves. Once you're out of your comfort zone, the things you know, then you have to say, well, what is this thing that I am?
Right.
Without the help of all the props that come with it. And I think in that sense, that kind of geographical dislocation accelerates some of the things that art demands from the artist. But the one thing I know for sure about art, especially after being a professor for many years, is that it's very difficult to know what are the elements that make good art. I wouldn't prescribe it, but I also think that there's many people who have been moved from many country to country that are tremendous jerks too. It might be me. I might be one of those. So life offers us opportunities, but it ultimately doesn't mean that we take those opportunities.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Kit Mai. I'm a Vietnamese. Came after the war, so I kind of related a little bit to you. My question is, when you build this house, was there nostalgia and how intense was it, if there was? And that next question would be, Cuba is your homeland. Is America your home, or Cuba is your home?
I mean, nostalgia didn't play a big role in the making of it. I think partly because when you start building something physically, like this, and you're trying to be accurate about it, matter of fact, confrontation with what the thing is overrides your desire to come up with bittersweet understanding of it. You know, now once it's built, for instance, my mother will be here next week, and at some point she will come and see this exhibition. I will feel probably what people associate with nostalgia when I see it through her eyes, but through my own, not so much. And then the home, you know, I live from 0 to 18, about a third in Cuba, a third in Spain, a third in Puerto Rico. And then I came here for college and have been here ever since. In some ways, I feel more Californian than anything else. I came to Northern California when I was 21, and now I'm 61, 40 years. But it's inevitable, and you might feel this in your own life, it's inevitable that there are things that are profoundly connected to that place of birth, of my language. I'm much better in English than I'm in Spanish. I write everything in English, but when I speak Spanish, it's a different emotional register for me. I'm not the same person in English and Spanish, which seems like a weird thing, and I can't help it. And even though I have done a lot of work related to exile, I am not sort of nostalgic about it or sad about it. It's just a fact. And sometimes facts have a certain quality that is so crystalline, you know. It's just a fact that informs the way I understand time and myself and community, and what you allow in and out, the porosity of being. Yeah. The what? Yeah.
My name is Gail Werner, and your wonderful installation, what happens to it when this show is over? Does it go to another museum?
Well, at the moment, we don't have any scheduled plans to travel it. So, to be determined. But if it goes nowhere, it will be taken apart, and you know, I have done some big installations. For example, when I did the project outside Santa Fe, there were 800 objects inside that place. And the pieces went, not all of them, but went all around the world and now exist in that way. It's only in a book. So yeah, it would be interesting to see what happens. It would be interesting to take this apart. Because even though I built it in my studio and rebuilt it here, it was not in its complete form. But when we take it apart, it will be, you know, really in its complete form with all the things, and that dismantling will in itself be something. You know, one of the interesting things that happens in making work, and making artwork, is that most people only see the end thing, while I see how we got there and how we end up. It's kind of like having a kid that everybody sees your kid as a finished thing, and you see it as all the kids that they were. And it's like that. So when I see it being taken apart, I will think of that as part of that work. The artwork incorporates into it is creation with all these different parts, and then it dismemberment. And it will only exist in our memory. For those of you who saw it, it will only exist like that. And then we'll make up stories that maybe are not exactly the same. You know, some people say it was very tall, some people say it was very short, and all of that will be part of the magic of the experience. Anything else? Yeah. There.
Hi, my name is Chloe. Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us. My friend Santi took your class at USC in poetry, and she brought me today. And my question for you is about the painting that was inspired by the poet Robertson Jeffers and his idea of inhumanism. And I was wondering if you could expand a bit more on how that inspired your work.
Yeah, that's a good question. So Robinson Jeffers, for those of you who don't know, Robinson Jeffers is a very important California poet for the early part of the 20th century. Interestingly enough, he was a USC graduate. And so I went to Berkeley for grad school. And at the time that I went to Berkeley for grad school, Czesław Miłosz was at the end of his time at Berkeley. And Miłosz is a Polish poet, but Miłosz was the person who introduced me to Jeffers. So I had to come to California to learn from a Polish poet about a California poet. And the reason why that is because many people don't know Jeffers, even though once upon a time he was arguably one of the top 3 more well-known poets in America. But because he opposed the war and had this idea of inhumanism, which now is very interesting to say the climate, people who are concerned with the climate are very interested in these ideas of Jeffers. But the reason why it's relevant, your question in here and the painting there of Jeffers and his 2 twins, is because Jeffers exiled himself along with his wife to Carmel. They were here in LA, there was a scandal, and they moved down there. So even though it seems like just a movement up north, when he built his house, Tor House, for him and his children and his wife, in some ways he was an exile of the ideas of the America of that time. Ultimately, partly we can think of an exile of history, of poetry in some ways, by becoming such an outsider. And the notion that you can find a piece of land from which to build something from scratch, an invention. Exile is connected to reinvention. That the exilic imagination is a process of living and reinventing and projecting. So that exilic imagination is in Jeffers, and then he built there in this little place in Carmel Point, another world that was not the world that he saw around him. Interesting enough, that world around him encroached into Jeffers, encroached into his house. And whenever I go there, I was there, I'm a fellow of the Tor House, and my daughter and I had the privilege of being at the Tor House for 5 days. I look around all this encroachment into Jeffers. The foundation had to sell all the parcels of land around it to raise funds to maintain the Tor House. And that encroachment in some ways speaks about a certain disappearance of an idea that was Jeffers, and also about what in many ways happened to many of our ideas and idealism.
Hi, I'm Lucas. And thanks for the talk. It was terrific. Just to pick up on two things you said that interested me, and ask you how to, just to expand. Kierkegaard's subjectivity, and you mentioned this idea that subjectivity can lead to objectivity. Quickly, that was a quick thing you said, so I want to just see if you can unpack that a little bit in light of this. You also mentioned Paul Celan, who had a wonderful poem, or a line I remember from a poem, where he said, in the end, we don't know what counts. Something like that. I don't know if I have it word for word. So, and then you also mentioned the unknowability, ultimately, of a work of art. So we can talk around it, sugar, this, interpret, and this makes us feel more secure, less insecure, more intelligent, more like we have a place to stand in this, chaos. I don't know. I'm sure there's a question in there somewhere, but it's maybe about is there any objectivity that you see? You have a group of people say, "Oh, Van Gogh is great. This is great. This is great. This is great art. This is not great art." And then we accept this as art history. We accept this as some kind of objective idea. So, I don't know. Just to take any of that.
It's nice to see you again, Lucas.
Nice to see you again.
I'm going to start from sort of your last question. Because this project of modernity, that the idea of rationality and that understanding has to do with what you can name and what you can describe and what you can put equations to, has compelled all of us to think that the more words we can throw at something, the more we understand it. And that includes the way we relate to one another. It's like we're constantly, trying to, that I am excited about you to the extent that I can say many things about you and I know you more, but really a lot of the time, the beautiful thing in the exchange is that which we cannot know. The mystery, the awareness of that, which is, when I look at you, that is really beautifully out of reach for me. And that is kind of the wonderful mystery of relating to one another. That no matter how many hours we spend together, how much I know about you, I won't have you. And that's the wonderful thing about it. And I think Kierkegaard has some things to say about it, although this is somewhat on the side of it. But I think for Kierkegaard, this idea of subjectivity is really all we have, that inward thing, right? So any attempts at the kind of understanding or pretension of locating ourselves outside of ourselves to reach some sort of objective point of view is nonsensical. And that what we need is, in fact, the acceptance and the deepening of extreme subjectivity, because it's only in its radical form that it opens up to the world, and we recognize in that extreme subjectivity all the connectivity with all things. And of course, in the case of Kierkegaard, that expands to God and so on. So this is partly why I mentioned early on that even though I write about my work and I can say other things, that I am so bored and tired of the little stories that everybody who seems to want to talk about art, and you see the press releases and some galleries that might never have taken a course on theory, all of a sudden are inserting words of theory. and all this stuff, and everybody has some sort of message to tell and lesson to teach. And I mean, it's not only trivial, but it's misguided, and quite often makes the work opaque. I can no longer see the work, I can only see that lens that has been offered to me to look at it. And then once that is there, it's almost too late to look at the work again. And I think the social media and all these things, because they're so textually based and all those things, have only exaggerated our belief in words. When most of what is essential about, say, another person is really best available without words. And the more somebody talks, the more confusing it becomes.
I think this is a great moment to end the confusion.